oh my, here it is. And she said, won't you come in? I thought, oh, if they get me in there, then I know him. I said, I'll just wait right here on the porch. She said, no, step in. I said, Mother's here. I thought, I know that. She said, Mother, just step in. I said, is it all right to wait right? She said, no, step in. I stepped and just barely stepped in, too. She shut the door, and I waited a little while, and I thought, oh, my. She got ready to come out. I thought, must be all right. So I thought, what's she going to say now? This is my last date. I know that. Boy, she going to tell me 20 cents an hour. I can never make her living like that. Living at home as she does. So I went down to church that night, and I was thinking, oh, my, right after church, had it made up. See there, you cross the bridge before you get to it? I said, now, well, she'll tell me after church, well, Billy, I'm sorry, but this is our last night together. I could just hear her say it. Oh, I didn't know she was going to say it. So I went out. I never heard a thing that Dr. Davis said. He just preached on. I never heard a thing. I was worrying about what was going to happen when I got outside of church. That night, when we left the church and we started walking home, I was walking down, the moon was shining bright. She said, did you work hard, Billy? I said, I sure did. I thought she never got that letter. See? She never got that letter. It hung up in the mailbox, or it hasn't been delivered. I got pretty brave, and I said, all right. I was going to look over at her, look her right in the face. And I thought she passed through that moon shine on her, how pretty she looked. I was going, oh, my. Ooh, I hope she don't get that letter now. So going on like that. And I was getting pretty brave, She said, Billy? I said, yes. She said, I got your letter. Oh. I said, you did? She said, Just kept on walking. I thought, well, woman, say something. Tell me get away or do something. You know how women can keep you in suspense. You brothers know what I'm talking about. And I just kept walking on. So I said, well, maybe she never read. I said, did you read it? She said, Just kept walking. Oh, my. Say something before you get up at the house. Sure enough. And I said, did you read all of it? She said, I said, well, what'd you think about it? She said, it was all right. Well, we got married. We got married, and before we got married, I know I had to ask their parents for it. She said, you'll have to ask Mother and Daddy. I'm in for it again. So I said, how about just asking your daddy? She said, well, either one of them. I said, thank you, honey. I went on out and remember that night, I was going to ask her daddy, and I sat down so nervous. He liked me. So I said, I was so nervous, and she's looking right at me laughing. And so I got up off the dual floor. I walked over, and she said, good night. I said, good night. I said, Mr. Runback? He said, yeah. I said, could I speak to you just a moment? He said, sure. He comes walking out, no great thing. Walked up on the porch, and I said, sure is a fine night. He said, yes, it is, Billy. I said, I like good weather, don't you? I was so nervous, I didn't know what to do. He said, yes. I said, go ahead, Bill, you can have her. I said, do you mean it, Charlie? He said, yeah, I like him today. I told him, oh, my. That was fine. I said, you talk to Mother about it. Will you do it? He said, oh, yes, I'll fix that up. It's all right. I said, Charlie, look, I said, I can't make her a living the way you do. I said, I'm only making 20 cents an hour. I said, I can't make her, but Charlie, I love her with all my heart. And I'll work as hard as I can to make her a living. He put his hand on my shoulder, fine man. He said, Billy, I'd rather you have her than anybody I know of. He said, you'll be good to her. And after all, happiness don't consist of how much the world's good you want. I said, Charlie, we'll be happy. And he said, well, I hope that you are, Billy. He said, be good to her. I said, I will. He said, I'm glad to know that you're going to get married. When we were married, we were happy. Oh my, we didn't have nothing. I remember when we went to housekeeping, we rented 2 rooms, and I went out and bought an old second-hand cooking stove. And I paid $1.75 for it and paid $1 for the grates to go in. Someone went to Sears and Roebuck and got one of them tables. Breakfast set was not painted. And I remember I painted a big shamrock on it because I was Irish. I painted a big shamrock on it. She just laughed about it. We had an old folding bed. Anybody know what a folding bed is? Somebody give it to us. We had 2 linoleum rugs and an old folding bed. We went to housekeeping, but brother, it was home. We had each other, and that's all we cared for. I become a minister and was preaching the gospel then. We had a little church and was preaching the gospel. I didn't make very much. And after a while, God blessed us in our home, and my little Billy Paul was sitting back there in the audience, come on the scene. I asked God to give me a little boy, and when he was born in the hospital, I first heard him scream in the room, delivery room. I said, Lord, it's a boy, and I now give him to you. His name shall be called Billy Paul. And the doctor came out in a few minutes and said, you have a fine boy in there. You like to see him? I said, yes, his name is Billy Paul. So he came out, and here he is with me today. Went on, and we struggled and worked and tried to make a living and go along the best we could. I'll hurry right through now as quick as possible to this tear-strained part. And then I was doing fine. We saved our money. I was still paying for an old Ford. And I remember we got a time where I could go up to Walljack, Michigan. Old Brother Ryan, he's somewhere in here today. I believe you'll see him along here. He's coming in. He's an old man. I used to thought he belonged to the house of David because he had long beard and hair. I went to see him at Michigan to fish a little while. We saved her money, and she wanted to stay home because they had a working group in the church, and she couldn't leave to go with me, and I could drive. It was about 200 better miles up there, and I went up to spend 2 or 3 days fishing. And on my road back, I passed through Mishawaka, Indiana, and there was people out there, and the worst church manners I ever seen in my life. They were screaming and shouting. Well, I never seen anything act like that. So I thought I'd believe I'd seen it. It was a Pentecostal group of people. The minister was named Rao, where he was holding, now somebody you might know, Reverend Mr. Rao from Mishawaka, Indiana. And they had a Pentecostal group. Well, I stopped and went to the door, and police directed the traffic on the outside. There's all up and down there, and those people were clapping their hands and screaming and running up and down the aisles and shouting. I thought, my, what a group. Well, you heard of those songs, something got a hold of me. It began to work on me a little bit, you know. Well, I counted my money. I had exactly $2.75 and had to go home. Well, I counted how much gas we would take me a tank of gas to get home. I had 75 cents left, so going on, the meeting was going on, they had a conference, a national conference, and I went out and got me a whole big bunch of stale rolls with sugar on them, and wrapped them up and put them under my seat, and I know I had to live off of that. Although they was having dinner there and so forth, but I had no money to put in, so I didn't want to eat from them when I couldn't put nothing in the offering. So I couldn't find a place to save, so I went out in the country in an old cornfield and stretched out my seat out of my car and put my trousers under there to press them that night and laid down. And I know that night they had a big bunch there, and they began to preach, and they said all the preachers come to the platform. 200 or 300 preachers walked to the platform. They had different ones and said, we haven't got time for all of you to preach. Just stand up and give your name, where you are. And when I come my time, I said, Reverend Branham, Jeffersonville, Indiana, sit down, evangelist. Like that was on next, like that went on through. And directly said some man was going to preach, a colored man. They had to have it in the north because they couldn't have it in the south on account of the colored and white together. There's an old fella out there, had one of those great, big old preacher coats on, long, old colored man, a little bit of rim of hair around like that, come walking out like this. You know, I'd heard all good preaching that day. He walked, first time I ever seen a microphone. I was watching the public dressing outfit, little bitty thing hanging there, big tabernacle, might all look good to me. I was looking around and over that. What amazed me is those people so free and happy. I never was used to that. And then this old man come out of it. Well, it looked like that's when that young man preached. Instead of that old man about dead. And he come walking out like this. He said, well, he said, children. He got to talking, he took his text. Now, a preacher's been preaching about the baptism of the Holy Spirit, and I was listening close and all these things. But he took his text back over in Job. Where was you when I laid the foundations of the world? When the morning stars sang together and the sons of God shouted for joy. Began to preach on that, and him, they preach on things down here, but he went up back there with Job. Come down through eternity, and down and come back on the horizontal rainbow. About time he got preaching there, about 5 minutes, that old stoved-up mass let out a yelp and screamed and jumped up in the air and clicked his heels together, threw his chest back, kicked off that platform like a little band of chickens, and said, "Well, you ain't even got a room up here for me to preach." I looked at that, and I said, "My, that's what I want. If it'll make an old man act like that, what would it do to me?" Well, I thought, that's what I want. And I said, I ain't going home till I find out more about this. That night out there, I knelt down and I said, "Oh, God, them people got something that I want." I said, "Let me have some of that." And I said, "Now, give me favor with them somewhere. When I go down there," I said, maybe this thing can get all over me and I'll feel that way." So I went on down there. You know, the Baptists don't act like that. You know, they have the, you know. And I know disregards to the Baptist church. That's all right. If the Baptists would have stayed back, listen, not long ago I was preaching at the Baptist church just as hard as I could preach, and all of them saying, "This is Starkey." I said, "Say, is this a Baptist church?" The pastor said, "Yes, sir." I got up preaching again, and I get a little wild, I guess you know that. So I got a little preaching up like that. Nobody said amen. I said, "Say, is this a Baptist church?" He said, "Yes, sir." I said, "Look, you all not Baptists. You're just church joiners. Down in Kentucky, where I come from, when we Baptists down there, when we get saved, we get out the altar and beat one another to back till we come through. That's real Baptist, brother. That's right. That's the kind of Baptist we need today. That's right. That's exactly right." And then but these people, how they were going on and praising the Lord, and I went out and I prayed, "God, let me get some of that. That's what I want." Next day, I went out to church about 10 o'clock. They just got through breakfast, and I had my rolls, and I come down and got me a drink at a fountain down there in the city, drove them all forward up, got out. I put on a pair of them seersucker trousers that morning, a little T-shirt. Nobody knowed me, not a soul. I walked in, sat down by a colored man. I was sitting there, and I thought, "Oh, my." All of them were clapping their hands and singing and shouting and screaming. I thought, "Oh, my, if I just had grace enough to do that. If I could just get loose to do that, I want that." I was watching. By and by, after a while, the little fellow come up to the microphone, and his name was Kurt from Cincinnati, and Ohio. And he said there was a young minister on the platform last night by the name of Branham. Said we want him this morning to come to the platform for the morning message. Seersucker trousers, T-shirt. Not me. I was way back there. I just kind of scooted down the seat like this. So again, he went ahead and he sang another song. He said, "Anybody inside or out know the whereabouts of Mr. Branham?" That young preacher on the platform. He said, "Come to the platform." Said, "You're to bring the morning message." I just sat real close. Never said nothing. That colored fellow looked towards me and said, "Do you know him?" What could I say? I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Go get him." Well, I couldn't lie to him. I said, "Listen, fella, I want to tell you something." He said, "Yes, sir." I said, I'm brother. So I said, "I can't get up there." I said, "Look at these trousers, see? Look at this T-shirt." He said, "Them people don't care how you dress." I said, "But look, I can't go up there." I said, "You just keep still. Don't tell them I'm here. See? Just keep still." He said, "Anybody know where Reverend Branham is?" I told him, I said, "Yeah, he is. Yeah." Here's other trousers, T-shirt. My face is red, you know. Oh, my. What was I going to do? I got a hold of my Bible. I said, "Lord, I prayed last night for something. Maybe it's you." I said, "What am I going to do? I can't preach around where them fellows are." I go up there and I started walking up. Everybody looking at me, you know, seersucker trousers. You know how they be pressed under a Ford seat. So this old T-shirt just stained all over, you know. I started walking up. I was up fishing. So I started walking up there and I said, well, people, I said, "I'm just a little bit, I don't know what I am." I said, I feel kind of funny. I said, I'm not used to your old religion. I said, and I said, I want to speak just a little, I do the best I can. And so I got a hold of over there where the rich man lifted up his eyes in hell. Something got a hold of me. The next thing I know, it's about a half hour later, I was out in the yard. What a time we had. Here come a fellow up with a big pair of Texas boots on, a big hat, but I'm Reverend so-and-so. I thought, well, I ain't so bad dressed after all. I said, you in ministry? He said, sure. I heard your message. I heard you as evangelist like for you come down to Texas and hold me a revival. I said, well, look, I'm just a young preacher. I just started. I said, I haven't got into this way just right when you ought to. I said, I like it. A fellow tapped me on the shoulder. He looked me had on a pair of those there knickerbocker pants. Blouse at the knees like I used to wear when I was a little boy. Golf clothes. He said, I'm Elder so-and-so from Miami. I said, you a preacher? He said, yes, sir. I thought, well, I'm all right, man. So he said, well, here, will you come hold a meeting for me? And a lady come up from somewhere way up in the Indian country said, oh, brother, we need you up there. I said, well, thank you, Lord. Thank you. Maybe this is what you're going to do something for me. I got over there. I began to take down their names and address. I said, I'll find out. I'll talk it over with the Lord, with my family. When I went home, I'll never forget running in. My wife always met me there, arms stretched out. I can see her yesterday, bless her heart. She come running to the door. I said, oh, honey, I got something to tell you. I met the best bunch of people in the world. I began to tell her all about how he's acting. She said, well, where's he at? I said, up at Mishawaka, Indiana. I said, you think they're ashamed of their religion? They just scream, shout, run, kick one of their hands. I said, they don't care. They're just as free like birds in the air. I said, she said, where's he at? I said, up in Mishawaka. The whole bunch of them up there. And I want to show you something. Reached down my pocket. I said, they have given me invitations to come to their churches to preach. I said, you believe it? She said, is that true, honey? I said, she said, well, maybe you could preach their kind of church. I said, they asked me to come. I said, well, I'll go. So I said, will you go with me? God bless her heart, she'd always go. She said, yes, honey, wherever you go, I'll go with you. We didn't have no money. We went and counted money, what we had, and I didn't have even enough to make a payment on the car. I said, well, look, honey, the Bible said, don't take nothing and take no thought. I said, the Bible said if you got 2 coats, give one of them to your brother and go on out. And he had supply. Now I said, do you think if you and the baby could go along and be, yes, we'll do it. Next thing we had to tell our parents then. And I went and told my mama here. Of course, mama is all right with her. I'm thankful for a good mother. And said, sure, honey, God bless you. Then we had to go, and this time her father and mother had separated. So I had to go to her mother. And when I went to her mother, she said, William? Oh my, I knew what was up. She said, you cannot take my daughter. I said, look, them's the nicest bunch of people. She said, I've heard of that bunch of people. They're holy rollers. And she said, you're not pulling my girl out across this world today. She's got something to eat, and tomorrow she's starving. Amongst that bunch of trash. And brother, I've come to find out this, and I say it from my heart. What she called trash is the cream of the crop. That's exactly right. I say that with reverence. That's true. Now, she said, I said, well, she's my wife, and she said, well, Mama, I want, well, there it was. Now, I said, she said, well, if she goes, her mother will go to the grave broken-hearted. And her wife started crying. Well, I couldn't stand that. So I told her, I said, well, we'll wait and go later. Now, there's where I made my mistake. Now, if I would have went on, this gift would have been in operation way before I called it to come amongst people who recognized it, you see. But I said, well, we won't go. And brother, sister, from right then, my trouble started. The first thing you know, my church began to drop off. My brother was killed suddenly, his neck broke. And riding on a car like this with his arm out, his neck was broke, his blood poured out on my other brother's body. I run to meet him, but it was too far. He died before I could get to him. My sister-in-law died a few days after that. My father died in my arms. Everything began to go wrong. Then the 37 flood came on. You heard about it. Many of you on your radios and things. The Ohio River swept out the country. My wife taking pneumonia. Little old Dr. Dare, I shall never forget him. He come with buddies. We fish together and hunt together and everything. One of the best doctors, medical doctors there is in the country. And we went to school together. He come up there and looked at her and said, Billy, said, that girl's got pneumonia. I just taken his Christmas present. And God had given us a little girl between that time, little Sharon Rose. I couldn't call her the Rose of Sharon, but I could call her Sharon Rose. And I called her Sharon Rose, and God gave her to us, and she's a sweet little lump, and we just loved her so much. And she just got to a place to where my mother would set her in her little four corners, out in the yard, and I'd come up and I'd blow the horn on the car like that. She'd recognize, she'd lift her little arms and go, goo, 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 goo. My, how I love that little lump of human flesh. I'd hold her in my bosom and kiss her and love her. My little boy, I just love little children, and God had given them to me, and I'd put them both on my back and piggyback and ride around, just as happy as we could be. Nothing, she had the two children, a little over 2 years, and then, but she taken pneumonia when she went to get the children's Christmas presents, and the doctor said she'll have to lay right here, Billy, because she's probably will die if she ever moves. But her mother come up and said she's going to move her down to her house. And Dr. Bear said she'll have to get another doctor, because I wouldn't do it till they wouldn't permit it. So she went and dismissed him and got another doctor and taken her down there. And the flood broke through, and then all of us was put on the rescue to work for the flood. We rushed right to the government hospital, where the temporary place of the hospital, the dike was breaking through, the city was washing away. I'll never forget those nights. I remember they called me, both babies were sick with pneumonia, and she's laying sick with pneumonia out in the hospital there with a fever 105, and both babies sick. And I come up and had my car, and I had a boat, and I raced on the river, and because I operated a boat pretty well, and everybody was just pulling people out of the flood, and people drowning and everything. And I got my boat. I was working on the wall, and someone come and said, "Oh, get down here, preacher, right quick, get your boat in down here. The dike broke through all over on Chestnut Street, and the houses are washing away, and there's a mother on top of the house out there with a bunch of little children, about 11 o'clock at night." I rushed down there real quick and threw my boat in the water, started up. I had to buck those waves as high as this tent almost, up in there where the dashing against the side of those buildings like that, and I heard a mother screaming. I looked over there, and she's standing on the top porch out over a house, and the waves is shaking that house like that with 4 or 5 little children standing around her. I could see where the street lights hadn't went out yet down through there. Now I went up through an alley like this with the boat, and this is washing things under. Went down through that way, finally caught to the post and threw the rope around and run in. The mother fainted. I picked her up and pulled all the children, packed and put them in the boat, and got back. Just as I got to the bank, I heard her say, "Oh, my baby, my baby." I thought she left a little baby in there. "Where's my baby?" Though she was talking about a little about 3-year-old child she had there. And I said, "Oh, my little baby laying in that house." And I went back again. I know the poor little thing, how I love children. And the waves are horrible then. I just got to the house and threw the rope around again and went in, looking all around. I couldn't find no baby. And just now I heard the house give away. And just as it gave away, I run real quick to the porch and grabbed the rope as the column went down and pulled a slip knot out of it. And then the current caught me, and out through the river I went like that. And I got out there, and I couldn't get my outboard started. Like that string is froze, sleeting, snowing, and I was trying to get it started, wouldn't start, and the current caught me. And there was a fall just below me. And I know what was going. There, sitting in that boat out there, rocking back and forth, the waves twisting like it, me pulling on that string, and it wouldn't start. I'd pull again, it wouldn't start. I thought, "Oh my, a half a mile farther and down through that chute I was going, they'll never find a piece of me." I wanted to go down through there, and I thought, "Oh God, the wages, the way of a transgressor is hard for him. Don't you never get that for what it is." And I thought, "Oh God," to begin to remember it. I began remembering then that He called me to go, and I didn't go, and I refused to go. During that time, we went ahead and received the Holy Spirit, both of us. And I was pulling the string, it wouldn't start. I got down, I thought, "There's little Billy Paul, I'll never see him again. There's little Sharon Rose, I'll never see her again. There's wife laying in a hospital, right at the point of death, I'll never see him. When they break the news to her that I'm gone and find my truck sitting there, and that some of them might have seen the house move away, what will happen?" I said, "God, have mercy upon me. Please, dear God, I don't want to die. I'm sorry that I did what I did." I said, "Help me to start." I pulled a chain, and away it started. And cut through and come way down the higher part and come back. Went and got my car real quick, left my boat tied up top of a tree where I could get back to it. I come up and got my car real quick, and someone said, "Why, the government debt will washed away a while ago," or the wife was. And I run up through there real quick, and I met a major there. I stopped and I said, "Major Weekly," I knew him. I said, "Is it true?" I said, "Yes, the water broke through, that all that hospital bunch was taken out of." said, I think that all of them got on a train, and they'd gone to Charleston, Indiana. And you can find them up there. I jumped in my car. I remember the last time I seen my little associate pastor. He grabbed me by the hand and he said, Brother Branham, if I never see you again, I'll see you in the morning. And that's our last salutation, one another, as we saluted one another. He died during the time of the flood. And he never died. He went home to be with Jesus during the time of the flood. A little boy filled with the Holy Ghost, a little Frenchman, Diarc was his name. And away we went. I went out there to try to get across, and when I got my boat down there and got up there, the Lancaster Creek up there had backed through for about 8 miles of water through there, swifter than it wasn't a river where it's cut around. And someone said, well, that train that crossed went on the trestle washed away, and every one of us drowned. Right out there. Oh, my. I thought, it can't be. And I tried again. I tried to pierce it, and I couldn't. Trying through the night, the water's taking me back. Come to find myself cut off from everybody. Setting out marooned up on a hill, and there for about 5 or 6 days, I had plenty of time to think all over my wrong when God called me to go and I didn't go. And sitting there thinking my baby and wife was drowned, my mother, where was she at? I didn't know where she was at. I didn't know where no one was at. And finally, when the river dropped enough that I could get a boat across, I rushed across and I said, maybe they went to Charleston. They told me the boat got through, the train got through. I went to a great big place in Charleston where they're keeping all the refugees. I went in there. They know nothing about nobody named Branham in there. I walked down the street and met old Colonel Hay, a very good friend of mine. He said, Billy, that train went through here. I don't think it even stopped. We went down to the dispatcher's office. He went down there and said, yes, said the engineer, the train will be in just in a few moments. It drove that train through. Said it was a cattle car. Her father was a Brotherhood organizer on the Pennsylvania, drives the south wind through now. And there it was, going out on the cattle car. And the sleet and rain upon them, I know they couldn't live like that. Now I have 2 sick children. And so how could I get to Columbus? I was cut off. And there, walking down the street, crying, wringing my hands, don't know what would take place. Someone run up to me and said, Billy, you're looking for hope, aren't you? And I said, yes, that's my wife's name. They used to call her Hope, Me-Face, and Little Baby, Little Billy Charity. So they said, you're looking for her. And I said, my girlfriend is in Columbus, Indiana, and your wife is laying by her side dying with tuberculosis. I said, no, it can't be. He said, yes, she is. I said, can you get me there? He said, yes, if you can walk a ways. I said, I can walk anywhere. We got up and got in the car, and I went to Columbus. I went up there, and I thought, where's she at? I run into that. They had it in a Baptist church down on the basketball floor, gymnasium. And I started down to that hard. There's cots everywhere, and people stretched off like this, and every sickness and everything. And I started screaming top of my voice, Hope, oh, Hope, where are you, honey? Where are you? I loved her. I love her yet. She's in a grave out there, but God knows she was a good, God-saved woman. And I looked, and I was crying, screaming, oh, where are you, Hope? I looked over and I seen an old, poor, bony hand go up in the air, and it was her. I'll never forget how I felt. My heart began to drop. Now I run over to her, fell down, and grabbed her hand. She did weigh about 130 pounds. She probably weighed 60 or 70. I was crying. I said, where's Billy? Where's Sharon? She said, they're in a home somewhere. So I'm going up. Yeah, Bill. And I said, no, honey, you look all right. You're going to be like, oh, God, have mercy. Please, dear Jesus. I said, will you have mercy? Let my wife get well. And I was bringing somebody tapping on the back. It was the doctor. Said, you Reverend Branham? I said, yes, come aside a minute. I said, yes, doctor. Said, is the same with there, your doctor at home? I said, yes, sir. He said, well, I'm going to tell you. He said, you better get ready for this. Said, your wife is going down. Said, she's got TB. And I said, that's galloping consumption. And said, she won't last for just a little while. I said, doctor, no, she can't go. I said, you looked at my baby? He said, yes, they've both been sick, but they're getting better. And I said, well, look, I'm going to take her home. And he said, you can't do that. He said, you just stay right here. Well, after finally, when I did get her down home, she just kept getting worse all the time. Dr. Derrick came back. They give her pneumothorax treatments. They done everything that could be done. She kept getting worse. I prayed and cried and begged with all my heart. It looked like it was black before me as you could see. Finally, they take her out to the hospital. They sent and got a doctor from Louisville. He come over and looked at her. He said, no, Dr. Miller from the TV Sanitarium. And he said, there's nothing to be done for our reverend, but she's going to die. That's all. Said, just might as well make ready for her to die. Said, because it's done in both lungs and just got to hold of her, so there's no hopes of saving her. What was I going to do? Oh, my. All the time I could hear that ring in my ears, like, oh, you give the opportunity, you wouldn't go. Like that. You reap what you sow every time. And I remember I went ahead trying to work, trying to get things so we could eat and I could pay my bills. And I was working one day, getting worse all the time she was, and I heard it come in and said for me to report at once at the hospital or my wife was dying. And I never will forget, I took off my hat, took off my coat, laid it down. I said, oh, God, have mercy on me and let me speak to her again before she goes. I turned the car, I was close to Henryville, Indiana, right Underwood, and down the road I came, rushed to the hospital, jumped out of the car and run up the steps real quick going into the hospital. And as I went in, I seen little doctor there coming down the hall with his head down. He looked at me like that. Tears broke through, and he turned his face and started running and motion to me. And I went up to him, I put my arm around him, I said, Doc, look, Sam, come here. What's wrong? And he said, I believe she's gone. I said, surely not. I said, go with me, Doc. He said, Billy, how could I go in there? So the girl took me and managed dinner. She was like my sister. Said, how could I go into her? I said, I don't want to see her no more. He said, you stay out here. And I said, I'm going to see her. He said, don't go in there, Bill. I said, yeah, I'm going. He said, here, call one of the nurses. You go with me. She had a little red medicine or something there. Little thing said, take this. I said, I don't need that. I walked in. I said, I want to go alone. I pulled the door behind me. I looked over there. She had real dark eyes, black hair, German girl. She's all doubled up like this. I looked down up on her. She just was still. I put my hand on her forehead. It's real sticky. It looked like she had a line. I put my hand over her head and I said, oh, God, please. I said, that's my baby's mother. Let me tell her goodbye. Will you do it, Lord? Let me tell her goodbye. I don't want her to go without telling her goodbye. Will you help me, dear God, in your forgiveness and your great heart? Will you just let me say goodbye to her? Her head moved. I looked down. If I live 100 years, I'll never forget those big dark eyes looked at me. She couldn't talk. She motioned her finger. I got a hand. She said, why did you call me? I said, honey, you're not going. She said, yes, I am. She said, I don't mind it. I just hate leaving the baby. She said, but I'm ready. And I said, honey, you're not going. No, you're all right. You're going to be all right. She said, now, Bill. And then the nurse broke in. She said, Reverend Branham, you come on out. She said, come here, the nurse. And she said, Edward, she knew her schoolmate, said, if you ever get married, I hope you have a husband like mine. And I said, oh, honey, don't say that. She said, I do. Edward started crying when I got out. She said, I want to tell you something, honey. She said, I'm going. And she said, it's glorious to go. She said, I was on my road and I had someone by each arm looked like white angels. And they were taking me down through a white path to my home. So I could hear you calling way back into the road. Oh, oh. Said, honey, it was just as peaceful. The great palm trees and birds like the dawn of the morning in an orange tropic. You know what I think? I think she was just on that bridge between the natural and the supernatural. She said, I'd be taken home, said, promise me one thing, that you'll always preach this glorious gospel of the Holy Spirit. She said, for it sure pays when you're going, Bill. She said, I guess you know why I'm going, don't you, honey? I said, don't say it. She said, no, not your fault. It was mine. I said, yes, honey, if I wouldn't listen to your mother, would listen to God instead of some woman, I'd be better off with her. She said, that's right, honey. But it'll come out all right for you. I said, I hope don't believe me. And she said, I have to go, honey. Said, I hate to leave you and the baby. She said, promise me something, will you? Said, I got some things to tell you. And I said, all right. Said, I have to tell you quickly because I'm going back to the waiting on me. She said, don't think I'm beside myself. I'm not. She said, do you remember that time you was in Louisville? And you wanted to buy that little old 22 rifle? And you didn't even have enough money to make a down payment? I said, yeah. She said, I always wanted to get you that rifle. She said, I've been saving the nickels to try to get enough money to make that down payment for it, $3. And she said, after I'm gone, when you go home, look up on the top of the old folding bed there in that newspaper and promise me you'll get the rifle. You want it so bad. You never know how I felt when I went back home and found about $2.75 laying there in nickels where she saved it. Allowing for herself to without stockings and things to put it up there. That's a real wife. Now, she said another thing I want to tell you. She said, you remember that time that you bought me them stockings? I sent you down to get stockings. And I said, yeah. She said, that was the wrong stocking. How it was, we were going to Fort Wayne. I was going to preach that night up there. And I was going up to Fort Wayne, and she sent me down to get some stockings. There's two different kinds. One called chiffon. And what's the other? Rayon and chiffon. And she told me, she said, go get me a pair. Is the rayon the best? Or she said, it cost 69 cents. She said, go get me a pair of rayon stockings while I'm getting ready. And I went out again. I was going down the street. I never buy any clothes for women. Didn't know any clothes. I was going down. She said, chiffon. Somebody said, hello, brother. I said, hello, chiffon. Going down and said, how you get along, Billy? I said, fine. Chiffon. I passed on a corner, a fisherman friend of mine met me in the corner. He said, oh, Billy, perch out on the piers or bike. I said, sure enough, crawfish is what they're hitting. I said, well, I got to go to Fort Wayne. I said, I'll meet you Monday. We're talking like that. Then when he left, I forgot what it was. Well, she sent me the pennies to get it. So I used to go with a little girl named Thelma Ford, and she was working at Newberry's, and I know that they kept them stockings in there, so I went in and thought I'd ask her. So I didn't want to show my ignorance to the people, and I went over there, and I said, she said, hello, Billy. And I said, hi, Thelma. She said, what do you want? I said, a pair of socks for Hope. She said, a pair of what? And I said, socks for Hope, no pair of socks. And I said, yes, ma'am, she wants socks, and she wants that full style, that thing in the back, you know. And what is, you know, I said, he said, she wants stockings. I said, well, whatever, what you want to call them. And then I thought I'd already showed how dumb I was, and I didn't want to get into it worse. She said, what kind does she want? I said, what kind you got? And she says, what's that, rayon? Chiffon, is that the kind? Well, she started, she said, well, we got some rayon. Well, I never heard. I said, that's what she wants. Sound like chiffon to me, chiffon, rayon. And I said, that's what she wants. And she said, she don't want rayon. I said, that's what she wants. And so she went and got them, going about 20-something cents. Well, I said, give me 2 pair of them. She said, are you sure that's... I said, that's what she wants. So I told them, I said, you know how you went, brothers like to go off to your women, you know. And I said, I'm Abraham's son, little Yiddish. I said, you don't know how to shop, honey. She said, did you get me chiffon stockings? And I said, yes. What the good kind was? And I said, yes, ma'am, that's what I got. And she was lady enough not to tell me about it. And when she got to Fort Wayne, I thought it was strange she had to have another pair of socks. But what it was, she told me, said, honey, I didn't want to tell you. She was too much of a lady, but I had to give them to your mother. This is for an older person. So I'm sorry I kept it back from you, but I just couldn't tell you. I said, bless your heart, sweetheart. I said, one more thing I want you to promise me. You won't live single. I said, oh, I can promise that. She said, don't live single. Have my children pulled about from post to post. She said, I'm going, Bill. She said, will you promise? I said, honey, I can't promise that. I said, promise me, won't you? The poor old feeble hands reaching up to me. Said, get a good girl that's got the Holy Spirit. She'll take care of the children. She said, Bill, I'll meet you. I said, all right. And I said, are you really going? She said, yes, I'm going. I said, sweetheart, someday, so help me God. I said, I'll take you out here to Walnut Ridge, and I'll bury you, and I'll leave a place there for myself in the case.